Don Knotts' hands would not stop shaking. It was March 3, 1976, 11:38 p.m. NBC Studios in Burbank. He was mid-sentence, mid-story, the same nervous, twitchy energy that had made him one of the most beloved comedic actors in American television history, suddenly no longer a performance at all, but something raw and uncontrolled, taking over his entire body in front of 20 million people watching at home. And Andy Griffith, seated beside him in the guest chair, 21 years into the deepest friendship either man had ever known, was out of his seat before Johnny Carson had even fully processed what he was witnessing, moving toward the man who had been standing beside him, one way or another, since a rehearsal hall in New York in the autumn of 1955. Coming up, the real reason Don Knotts' hands had been shaking for years before that night, the promise Andy Griffith made him backstage that nobody outside their closest circle ever knew about, and what happened when a 52-year-old man finally stopped performing nervousness and simply admitted he was afraid. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that they were witnessing the exact private struggle that Don Knotts had spent 20 years transforming into one of the most beloved comedic performances in the history of American television. Andy Griffith and Don Knotts met in the autumn of 1955 during rehearsals for a Broadway production called No Time for Sergeants, a military comedy in which Griffith, 29 years old and still relatively unknown, was originating the lead role, and Knotts, 31, and struggling to establish himself after years of modest success in radio and early television, had been cast in a small supporting part. Their first meeting, according to an account Griffith gave in a later interview, occurred during a break in rehearsal when Griffith noticed Knotts sitting alone in a corner of the rehearsal hall, visibly agitated, his hands moving restlessly, and rather than assuming this was simply pre-performance nerves, Griffith approached him directly and asked whether he was all right. Knotts, surprised by the directness of the question from someone he barely knew, admitted that he struggled with nervousness more than most people realized, an admission Griffith later said struck him as unusually honest for an industry where most performers worked hard to project constant confidence. Griffith responded by sharing something about his own background, his brief consideration of the ministry, his understanding that most people carried burdens considerably heavier than what they showed the world, and the two men talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, well past the point when rehearsal had resumed without them, a conversation that both men later cited as the genuine foundation of a friendship that would last, without significant interruption, for the following 51 years. According to accounts given by both men across the following decades, their friendship developed with unusual speed, built initially around Griffith's genuine appreciation for the specific quality of anxious, twitchy comedic energy that Knotts brought even to his brief moments on stage, an energy that Griffith recognized immediately as something considerably rarer and more difficult to produce than ordinary comedic timing. What Griffith did not fully understand for several more years, though he began to suspect it fairly early in their friendship, was that the anxious, nervous energy Knotts projected so effortlessly in performance was not, in fact, entirely constructed. Don Knotts had struggled with genuine, clinically significant anxiety since childhood, a condition that would not be fully understood or properly named by medical science for decades after his own death, but that manifested throughout his entire life as a specific and persistent nervous energy, trembling hands, a racing heart, an almost constant undercurrent of apprehension that Knotts had, through years of difficult trial and error, learned to channel into a performance style so precisely calibrated that audiences experienced his very real anxiety as pure comedic genius. Knotts grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, the youngest of 4 sons in a family shaped significantly by his father's severe alcoholism and what would today likely be recognized as serious untreated mental illness. A home environment that young Don experienced as consistently unpredictable and frightening in ways he rarely discussed publicly throughout his career. The specific texture of this childhood instability deserves fuller documentation because it explains so much about the particular quality of anxiety that Knotts carried into his adult professional life. His father, William Jesse Knotts, suffered from what family members later described as severe episodes that today would likely be recognized as symptoms of serious mental illness compounded by chronic alcoholism, periods during which he became unpredictable and occasionally frightening to his young sons, followed by stretches of relative calm that never fully reassured a household that had learned, through repeated experience, that the calm could dissolve without warning. Don, as the youngest child, absorbed this unpredictability during his most formative years, developing what child psychologists would today likely recognize as a form of hypervigilance, a nervous system calibrated constantly toward detecting the earliest possible signs of danger in an environment that had taught him, repeatedly, that danger could arrive from nowhere. His mother, Elsie, worked tirelessly to provide stability where she could, but the specific damage of growing up with an unpredictable father had already been done by the time Don reached adolescence, embedding itself into his body in ways that would follow him for the rest of his life, regardless of how successful or secure his adult circumstances eventually became. His father died when Don was 13, and rather than resolving the household's instability, this loss left a specific residue of hypervigilance in young Don that never fully departed, an ingrained expectation that safety could disappear at any moment, that the ground beneath him might shift without warning. He discovered performance as a teenager, initially through ventriloquism, and found something remarkable in the specific experience of standing before an audience, that the same nervous energy that made his daily life difficult to navigate could, if properly channeled and timed, produce genuine and reliable laughter, a transformation of his most persistent private difficulty into something the world found not just tolerable but actively delightful. His first ventriloquist dummy, which he named Danny, became, according to accounts given by his siblings, something considerably more significant to young Don than an ordinary childhood hobby. He practiced for hours alone in his bedroom, developing not just technical skill, but an entire alternate voice through which he could express thoughts and feelings that felt too dangerous or too vulnerable to say directly in his own voice, in a household where directness had rarely produced safety. When he performed for the first time in front of an actual audience, a small local talent show in Morgantown when he was 13 years old, he experienced something he later described, in one of his rare candid interviews about his early life, as the first moment he had ever felt genuinely safe while other people were watching him, a paradox that would define the entire remainder of his professional life. The stage becoming for Don Knotts not a place of exposure and danger, but one of the only reliable places where his anxiety could be transformed into something valuable rather than something to be hidden or ashamed of. This discovery became the foundation of an entire career, but it also meant that Don Knotts spent nearly 5 decades performing, night after night, a heightened and stylized version of his own genuine and unresolved anxiety, a specific arrangement that worked brilliantly for audiences and cost him, privately, more than almost anyone in his professional life ever fully understood. Andy Griffith, by contrast, had grown up in Mount Airy, North Carolina, in a home that was modest but considerably more stable than Knotts' childhood, and had briefly studied to become a Baptist preacher before discovering, through his work in music and later in comedic monologues, that performance offered him a different kind of calling than the ministry had. He carried, throughout his adult life, something of that early theological training in his approach to the people around him, a specific attentiveness to genuine suffering underneath a polished surface, a habit of listening for what a person was not saying as carefully as he listened to what they were. When Andy Griffith's show began production in 1960, 5 years into his friendship with Knotts, Griffith specifically fought to have Knotts cast in the role of Deputy Barney Fife, understanding, with a clarity that television executives initially did not share, that Knotts possessed a specific and irreplaceable comedic instrument that the show desperately needed. The production itself, once underway, developed a specific rhythm that accommodated Knotts' genuine anxiety in ways that almost nobody outside the immediate cast and crew ever understood. Griffith, according to multiple crew members who worked on the show across its 8-season run, developed a habit of checking in privately with Knotts before particularly demanding scenes, brief conversations conducted quietly away from the rest of the cast, offering reassurance or simply presence during moments when Knotts' genuine nervousness threatened to overwhelm his ability to perform the character's fictional nervousness convincingly. One longtime crew member later recalled an incident during the show's 3rd season, when Knotts, preparing for a particularly complex scene involving extended dialogue, became visibly overwhelmed during a break, his hands shaking with an intensity that went beyond his usual baseline, and Griffith, noticing immediately, canceled the remaining setups for that day without extensive explanation to the rest of the production, simply telling the director that Don needed a day to rest, absorbing whatever scheduling complications this caused, without ever publicly attributing the delay to anything beyond ordinary production needs. This pattern repeated itself, according to several crew members, with enough regularity across the show's run that it became, in its own quiet way, an accepted and largely unspoken part of how the production operated. Griffith functioning as a kind of invisible protective structure around his friend's genuine vulnerability, allowing Knotts to continue producing some of the most beloved comedic work in American television history without the broader industry ever fully understanding what that work actually cost him privately. What almost nobody involved in the production fully understood in those early years was that Griffith was also, quietly and without any public acknowledgement, functioning as something considerably more significant than a co-star in Knotts' life, a steady and reliable presence who understood, better than anyone else in Knotts' professional orbit, exactly how much genuine private difficulty sat underneath the anxious comedic persona that was making both of them increasingly famous. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens on that stage in a few minutes is unlike almost anything either of these two men ever did together in public again. By 1976, Don Knotts had built an extraordinarily successful career, built substantially on the specific nervous energy that had once been simply a private difficulty. 5 Emmy Awards for his work as Barney Fife, a string of successful films, a public identity so completely associated with anxious, twitchy comedic timing that audiences had come to expect it from him in every appearance. A specific and considerable irony that both delighted and, according to people close to him, occasionally exhausted him privately. His actual anxiety, meanwhile, had never been treated in any clinical sense, an era in which mental health struggles carried a specific stigma that made most men of Knotts' generation deeply reluctant to seek any kind of formal support. And Knotts, despite decades of built-up professional success, continued to experience genuine and sometimes overwhelming episodes of anxiety that he managed almost entirely through the same performance mechanisms that had sustained him since childhood. Andy Griffith, throughout the years since their Broadway meeting, had remained one of the very few people who understood the full difference between Knotts' performed nervousness and his genuine private struggles, and had made, at some point in the mid-1960s, according to a conversation he described decades later to a close friend, a private promise to Knotts that he would always be available, without judgment or hesitation, if the anxiety ever became something Knotts could no longer manage alone. Johnny Carson had booked both men for that evening's broadcast for entirely ordinary reasons, a reunion appearance to discuss their enduring friendship and their upcoming projects, a pairing that Carson's producers considered simply good television, given both men's enormous popularity and their well-documented decades of collaboration. Carson himself had a genuine personal fondness for both men that extended well beyond ordinary professional courtesy, Having interviewed each of them individually many times over the years, and having developed, in particular, a specific appreciation for the easy, unguarded rapport they displayed whenever they appeared together, he mentioned, in a brief comment to a producer before the broadcast that evening, that pairing Griffith and Knotts together always produced some of his favorite conversations of any given month, precisely because their decades of genuine friendship made the on-camera interaction feel considerably more natural and considerably less performed than many of the show's other celebrity pairings. Carson had no way of knowing, walking into that particular broadcast, exactly how true that observation was about to become, or how completely the natural, unguarded quality of their friendship was about to reveal itself in front of his entire viewing audience. Nobody on the production staff understood, walking into that broadcast, that Don Knotts had, 3 days earlier, learned that a persistent and troubling set of physical symptoms he had been experiencing for several weeks warranted further medical investigation, the diagnostic uncertainty that had triggered, in the specific way that uncertainty always triggered his anxiety, an escalating private dread that he had not yet found a way to discuss with anyone beyond his immediate family. He arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon appearing, to the production staff who greeted him, entirely normal, his professional composure intact. Though Andy Griffith, arriving separately and greeting him backstage, noticed something in his old friend's handshake, a specific tremor, slightly more pronounced than Knotts' usual baseline nervousness, that made him quietly ask, in the few minutes they had alone before the broadcast, whether everything was all right. Knotts, according to what Griffith later described, said only that he was fine. A response Griffith recognized immediately, from 21 years of friendship, as almost certainly untrue. The broadcast began warmly, both men trading familiar and beloved stories about the production of their television show, Carson delighting in their easy, decades-deep rapport, the studio audience responding with the specific warmth reserved for genuinely beloved performers whose friendship audiences had followed for years. Roughly 14 minutes into the segment, Carson asked, with entirely innocent curiosity, whether Knotts ever grew tired of playing such consistently nervous characters across his long career. Knotts began to answer with his usual practiced, self-deprecating humor. And then, according to everyone present, something shifted. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Don Knotts' hands, which had been resting on his knees in a posture the studio audience read as his familiar comedic nervousness, began to shake with a visible intensity that went considerably beyond his usual performed twitchiness. His breathing grew audibly shallow, and his face, normally so expressive and controlled even in its exaggerated anxious register, took on a genuine pallor that several people present immediately recognized as different from anything they had seen from him before. He tried to continue his answer, but his words began to falter, sentences breaking apart mid-thought in a way that bore no resemblance to his familiar comedic stammer, something considerably more frightening and considerably less controlled taking over in real time in front of the cameras. The studio audience's warm laughter died completely, replaced by a specific and immediate concern, several people rising partway from their seats, genuinely uncertain whether they were witnessing a medical emergency or an extension of Knotts' familiar anxious persona pushed to an unfamiliar extreme. Ed McMahon, seated at his customary position beside the desk, later described this exact moment as one of the strangest and most disorienting of his entire career because Don Knotts' performed nervousness had become such a completely reliable and beloved element of American popular culture that even experienced television professionals in that studio found themselves, for several long seconds, uncertain whether the escalating tremor and breathlessness constituted a bit or a genuine emergency, a confusion that McMahon said revealed something important about exactly how completely Knotts had mastered the specific art of making real distress look, to the untrained eye, indistinguishable from comedic performance. Andy Griffith did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He was out of his own chair immediately, turning fully toward his old friend, and knelt down beside Knotts' chair with a directness that revealed exactly how many times, across 21 years of friendship, He had likely needed to respond to some version of this exact moment in private, away from cameras. He took both of Knotz's trembling hands in his own, holding them firmly, and said, his voice carrying a specific fierce steadiness that the boom microphones captured with complete clarity, "Jess, look at me. It's Andy. You're safe. Just breathe with me." This detail, his use of the name Jess, a private nickname drawn from Knotz's actual middle name that almost nobody outside their closest circle knew Griffith used, was noticed immediately by people present who understood television well enough to recognize that this was not performance, that Griffith had reached instinctively and without a moment's calculation for the specific private language of genuine and long-established intimacy rather than anything resembling public address. Knotz's breathing gradually began to steady, matching, almost involuntarily, the deliberate steady rhythm Griffith was modeling beside him. Johnny Carson had risen from behind his own desk, genuinely alarmed, uncertain whether medical assistance needed to be summoned immediately, but something in Andy Griffith's total and complete command of the situation told him, with the specific instinct that had made him the most trusted host in American broadcasting, that whatever was happening was already being handled by exactly the right person. A friend who clearly understood, with a depth Carson could only begin to guess at, precisely what his old friend needed in that exact moment. What followed was not, in any conventional sense, entertainment. Production staff, understanding the genuine seriousness of the moment, quietly moved to an unscheduled commercial break, and what happened during those minutes off camera has been described, in the years since, by several people who were present, painting a picture of Andy Griffith remaining kneeling beside Don Knotts' chair for the entire break, continuing to hold his hands, continuing to speak to him in a low, steady voice that nobody beyond the two of them could fully hear. When the broadcast resumed, both men had recovered sufficient composure to continue, though the remainder of the segment carried a considerably different quality than its earlier light-hearted tone. Both of them visibly more subdued, Griffith's hand remaining protectively on Knotts' arm for the duration of the conversation that followed. Carson, reading the moment with the sensitivity that had defined his decades of hosting, asked gently whether either of them wanted to say anything to the audience about what had just occurred. Andy Griffith spoke first. He said, quietly, that Don Knotts had spent his entire remarkable career giving audiences a version of anxiety that made them laugh, and that almost nobody watching had ever fully understood that the anxiety underneath the performance was genuinely real, that his old friend had been carrying something considerably heavier than a comedic character for longer than either of them could clearly remember. Don Knotts, his composure largely recovered, added, in a voice considerably quieter than his usual public register, that he had spent so many years turning his own fear into something people found delightful, that he had almost forgotten it was possible for someone to simply respond to the fear itself, directly, without needing it transformed into anything. The studio audience, absorbing the full weight of this exchange, began to applaud, not the light appreciative applause that had characterized the evening's earlier moments, but something considerably more sustained and more genuinely moved, the sound of an audience honoring something true rather than simply responding to entertainment. Several audience members present that evening later described the specific quality of that applause in interviews conducted years afterward, distinguishing it clearly from the ordinary appreciative response the show typically received, even for its most successful comedic segments. One woman, interviewed decades later for a retrospective documentary about the golden age of American variety television, said she had attended dozens of tapings across her lifetime, but that the specific texture of the room that night, the transition from concerned silence into something that felt more like collective relief and gratitude, remained one of the most vivid memories of her entire life as a television audience member. She said that watching Andy Griffith kneel beside his friend without a single second of visible calculation had taught her something about genuine loyalty that she carried with her for the rest of her own life, a small but permanent shift in how she understood what real friendship actually required when it mattered most. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an unusually high volume of calls in the hours following the broadcast, viewers writing and calling specifically to say that watching two men who had spent decades making America laugh together handle a genuine crisis with such immediate, unguarded tenderness had moved them in ways they had not expected from an evening of television. Several of these callers, according to the production staff member who logged responses that week, specifically mentioned their own friendships of many decades standing, describing a renewed appreciation for the friends who had quietly supported them through difficulties the broader world never fully saw, and expressing gratitude for a broadcast that had, entirely by accident, given public and dignified expression to exactly that kind of underappreciated loyalty. Don Knotts' medical situation, investigated in the weeks following that broadcast, turned out to be considerably less serious than the uncertainty had initially suggested. Though the specific fear of the unknown diagnosis had been entirely genuine and entirely responsible for the anxiety episode that overtook him on stage that night, he continued working for nearly 3 more decades after that broadcast, his career remaining enormously successful. Though, according to people close to him, he began, in the years following that Tonight Show appearance, speaking somewhat more openly in private conversations about the genuine anxiety underneath his comedic persona, a shift that several close friends specifically credited to the experience of having that anxiety witnessed and met with tenderness rather than confusion or embarrassment on a public stage. Don Knotts died on February 24, 2006, at the age of 81. Following a battle with pulmonary and respiratory complications. In his final months, according to his family, Andy Griffith visited him regularly, maintaining the same steady presence he had offered his friend for over 50 years, sitting with him for long stretches without requiring conversation, understanding, as he always had, that Knotts sometimes needed presence considerably more than he needed words. Andy Griffith, at his memorial service, gave a eulogy that referenced their friendship with a specific emotional openness that surprised even people who had known both men for decades, describing Knotts as the truest friend he had ever had, and specifically mentioning, though without providing full detail to the broader public, a night many years earlier when he had needed to remind his old friend that he was safe and that being afraid did not mean being alone. He told the assembled mourners that he considered it one of the great privileges of his own life to have been trusted, across 5 decades, with the full and complete truth of who his friend actually was, underneath the beloved anxious persona the world had come to know and cherish, and that he hoped Don had understood, in whatever way mattered most, exactly how completely he had been loved, not despite his genuine struggles, but including them, as an inseparable part of the whole and remarkable person he had always been. Andy Griffith was seen, by multiple attendees, weeping openly during his remarks, a rare public display of grief from a man who had spent his own career projecting the same steady, unshakable warmth that had once helped his closest friend find his way back to stillness in front of 20 million people. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood. Something that connects the entire arc of their friendship back to that single moment on the Tonight Show stage. In the years following Knotts' death, Andy Griffith occasionally spoke, in careful and limited terms, about what he had learned from decades of friendship with a man whose genuine anxiety he had witnessed and protected far more often than the public ever knew. He said, in one late interview, that he had come to believe the entire premise of Barney Fife, the character audiences had loved for its exaggerated nervousness, only worked as brilliantly as it did because the exaggeration was built on top of something genuinely real, that Don Knotts had not been performing a caricature of anxiety from a comfortable emotional distance, but had been channeling his actual lived experience into something precise and controlled enough to make audiences laugh rather than worry, a feat of emotional discipline that Griffith said he considered one of the most remarkable and least appreciated achievements in the entire history of American television comedy. He said that watching his friend do this, night after night, decade after decade, had taught him something about the specific relationship between vulnerability and genuine artistry, that he never fully articulated publicly until very late in his own life, that the performer's audiences loved most completely were often the ones who had found a way to transform their most difficult private truths into something the world could receive as pure joy, without ever fully understanding the cost of that transformation. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the people in your own life who perform a version of strength or humor that might be covering something considerably more difficult underneath. You do not need decades of friendship and a television camera to offer someone that same steadiness. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being afraid does not mean being alone. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when friendship became something considerably more important than entertainment. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and telling me about the friend in your own life who has always known exactly what you needed, even when you couldn't say it yourself.